This weekend we celebrate Shabbat UK. One of the great mitzvot that we dedicate ourselves to every Shabbat, unique to the Jewish woman, is the mitzvah, the commandment of lighting the Shabbat candles. What is the significance of lighting these candles? What indeed is its origin? Twice in the Torah do we find this specific commandment in regard to the keeping of Shabbat within the Ten Commandments. In the first instance, in the book of Exodus, in the portion of Yitro, where God first gives the Ten Commandments, and there, in doing so, within the keeping of Shabbat, it uses the word zachar, to remember Shabbat. And indeed, that's what we do. We remember Shabbat in a commemorative way by doing various different rituals, including the lighting of candles. Elsewhere, in the book of Deuteronomy, we also find reference to the Ten Commandments, albeit there, when it talks about Shabbat, it uses the word shamar, which means to safeguard the Shabbat. There, in the context of ensuring not to do the things that you're not supposed to do on Shabbat. So which word did God use? Was it zachar or shamar, to remember or safeguard? And indeed our sages tell us that zachar v'shamar b'dibur echad. God used both words simultaneously, remember and safeguard. And it's in commemoration of these two words that indeed it is customary to light two Shabbat candles every Friday night. So that then begs a question that is asked by some of the classic mystics. Why do we indeed begin by the lighting of the candles? Why not, in the first instance, commence with the making of kiddush on the wine? And the answer is because these candles represent something more than just the significance of Shabbat itself. Shabbat is not just marking the end of a week. It's really a celebration of creation itself. When we look into the words of the kiddush, we don't just make reference to the fact that God rested on the seventh day, but we also talk of the fact that God created the world over 6 days. So in that sense, Shabbat is a celebration of the whole creation cycle. Indeed, the 6 days of creation and the seventh day of resting. And thus, just as on the very first day of creation, God brought about light, that's what we do first as we bring in Shabbat. We bring about light as well. Now let's look at this light. Let's talk about this light for a moment. What exactly is this light? Well, what was the light that God brought about on the first day of creation? It wasn't the sun, moon, or stars, because those luminaries came about on the fourth day. The light, we are told, that God brought about on the first day of creation was a unique type of light that would enable man to literally see from one end of the world to the other. And yet God foresaw that, in essence, evil would come about in the world, evil men would come to be, and as such, they would abuse this sort of light. And so he stored it, as it were, and made it uniquely available to just the righteous. But, as Jewish mysticism tells us, this light is available to all of us as Shabbat enters. Indeed, the candles themselves on the Friday night contain something, some of the power, some of the energy of that unique light that God brought into being on the first day of creation. And let's face it, as my 10-year-old daughter once observed already a number of years ago, "Mommy, why is it that the lights on Friday night seem so different than all the other kind of lights over the course of the week?" Good question. It just is, because it's unique, it's extraordinary. Let us also consider the fact that Jewish law tells us the significance of this light is simply so that you don't go bump in the dark. By definition, it's there for the purposes of what we call shalom bayit, that there should be peace in the home. In other words, simply put, there's a practical point to having light so that you don't end up eating in the dark or stubbing your toe. But here again, it represents something more significant, because Friday night, as Shabbat comes in, it gives us pause to be able to reflect on the people in our lives that we may have otherwise been overlooking during the course of the rat race of every work week. So when Friday night comes in and we're able to pause, the light shines bright. We're able to see the other people around us. We're able to genuinely pay attention to the significant people of in our lives, to be able to look at our husbands, at our wives, at our children, and appreciate them for who they really are. Shabbat is not just a day of rest. Shabbat is not just a celebration of the creation cycle. Shabbat is all about light. It's about opening up our own eyes. It's about seeing the world for what it really is, and the people that are significant and really make a difference to our personal world. There is one last point to consider in this regard. On January 1st, 2000, the New York Times ran a special Millennium Edition. And it was a special issue that featured front pages. One was the news from January 1st, 1900, and the other was a projection of what the news would be on January 1st, 2100. That fictional page included things like welcome to the 51st state, Cuba, or a discussion about whether robots should be allowed to vote, and so on and so forth. All kinds of fascinating details that one might anticipate being in a newspaper all those years on. But quite amazingly, this fictitious page created of imagining what the world would be looking like in the future also included, as the New York Times always includes each week, the exact time for the Shabbat candle lighting time. And when the editor was asked, an Irish Catholic, about why this indeed was included, he said, to be honest with you, as to what's going to happen in the future, that's pretty much impossible to predict. But one thing you can be certain, in the year 2100, Jewish women will still be lighting Shabbat candles. That's the meaning of more than the Jews have kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jews. It links us to our past, it connects us to our future, it brings light into our lives, and shines a way forward. That's what the candles represent, the unity of our people, the eternity of our people. May we all indeed enjoy the illumination of the Shabbat candles. May we all be able to properly experience the radiance of what Shabbat brings into our lives. And may you all have a Shabbat UK Shalom.